I've covered a lot of Karen stories on this channel. People who ignore rules, argue over nothing, and refuse to back down. But the cases we're looking at today, they might be the most ridiculous ones yet. From a Karen electrocuting herself while sabotaging her neighbor's Christmas lights, to a Karen requesting a refund over a fully eaten chicken, which ended in the most stupid way possible. It was around 6 in the evening on December 22nd, 2019, in Mesa, Arizona. Temperatures had dropped after sunset, and families were outside enjoying the holiday season. Kids were riding bikes, and neighbors were admiring the gorgeous light displays before heading inside for dinner. Well, everyone except 52-year-old Lyra Denise Laurent. Denise was a retired insurance clerk, which, in my experience, usually means someone with way too much free time on their hands. Denise loved rules, structure, and most importantly, telling other people what to do. Even though she held zero actual authority, she acted like she was the president of the HOA, the city council, and the entire state of Arizona. I seriously can't stand people who can't mind their own business. And Denise was the absolute on a different level. For 3 weeks, Denise had been completely obsessed with a young couple across the street, Eric and Melissa. They had put up an elaborate Christmas display with thousands of lights. Most people loved it, but Denise absolutely hated it. She complained the lights were obnoxious and violating regulations, even though she couldn't name a single rule they broke. She called the HOA, the management company, and even the city demanding to see their decorative lighting permits. Like, who even asks for that? Every single complaint went nowhere because the display was 100% legal. To a normal person, that would be the end of it. But to Denise, and this is where it gets truly unhinged, it was just the beginning. On the night of December 22nd, neighbors saw Denise pacing by the property line, taking photos. Around 6:30, Eric and Melissa left for a holiday party. I guess Denise saw this as her moment to strike. Security cameras captured her crossing the street carrying a pair of pruning shears and a small step ladder. She was going to disable the display herself. Here's the catch. The lights were powered by outdoor extension cords connected to a weather-protected outlet. It was safe, but definitely not designed for an angry neighbor doing unauthorized electrical work in the dark. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? Denise set up her ladder and started cutting the zip ties securing the wires. But earlier that season, landscaping equipment had damaged one section of the wire. It was wrapped in electrical tape, and a proper repair was scheduled for after Christmas. As Denise yanked on the bundle, that tape section pulled apart. Suddenly, there was a bright flash. Neighbors heard a loud pop, followed by Denise screaming. Electric current shot right through the exposed wire and into the metal pruning shears she was holding. This part is just terrifying to imagine. The shock caused her muscles to lock instantly, so she couldn't even drop the tool. She was stuck there for several horrifying seconds before the circuit breaker finally tripped and shut everything down. A neighbor rushed over and found her lying by the ladder. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but tragically, Denise died later that night at a trauma center from a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. When the news spread, the whole neighborhood was stunned. Investigators later reconfirmed that the lights violated absolutely no rules. Eric and Melissa kept the display running through Christmas, and neighbors continued stopping by to admire it for the rest of the season. In the end, Denise spent weeks trying to force her neighbors to take down their Christmas lights, only to lose her life trying to do it herself. Denise ignored a string of complaints and warnings, but the next woman ignored something much harder to miss: an active disaster zone. It was October 19, 2013, in Tagbilaran City, Bohol. Just 4 days earlier, a powerful earthquake had shaken the region. Stores were reopening, but many still showed visible damage. Customers moved cautiously, nerves remained high, and people were still uneasy about possible aftershocks. At work, 49-year-old car rental owner Vilma Castro was efficient and hyper-organized. But outside of work, neighbors described Vilma as someone who hated the word no, especially from security guards or anyone she deemed beneath her. And parking? Don't even get me started. To Vilma, red curbs and emergency zones were just VIP parking spaces meant for her quick errands. At exactly 11:30 a.m., Vilma rolled up to a commercial building in her SUV. There were perfectly safe, legal parking spots open just a little further down the lot. However, walking an extra 20 steps in a post-earthquake disaster zone was not an option for her. Vilma parked dead center in the red-marked fire lane, completely ignoring the massive signs warning drivers not to block it. According to the report, a security guard politely asked her to move because emergency rescue crews needed that lane completely clear. Instead, she scoffed dismissively and gave him that classic, deeply annoyed attitude about how she was only going to be a brief moment. The guard, realizing, like I often do, that he wasn't paid nearly enough to argue, just noted down her license plate number and let her march right inside. At 11:50 a.m., a sharp, nasty aftershock hit the block. Inside the store, shelves shook and people panicked. Outside, the security team noticed a huge, terrifying new crack spreading across the concrete facade directly above the entrance, right over the fire lane and right above Vilma's SUV. Within 3 minutes, they cordoned off the area with bright yellow caution tape to save lives. But they didn't account for the unstoppable force that is a Karen on a mission. Security footage from 11:55 a.m. is just wild to me. Vilma walked out holding 2 shopping bags, completely unfazed by the chaos. She saw the caution tape, and she saw the guard explicitly pointing her toward the safe, designated side exit. But Vilma looked at the side route, looked at her SUV. In front of a crowd of horrified onlookers, Vilma literally ducked under the caution tape and marched right into the danger zone. I seriously cannot comprehend the sheer stubbornness it takes to do something like that. Employees screamed and guards waved their arms wildly, but Vilma ignored them all, probably thinking they were just trying to ruin her day. She reached for the door handle, pressed her remote key clicker, and at that exact millisecond, another aftershock occurred. A massive, heavy slab of the damaged concrete facade tore loose from 20 feet up, and we are talking concrete, tiles, and bent steel reinforcement beams dropping straight down like an anvil in a cartoon. The first pieces completely demolished the hood and windshield of her precious SUV, but the heaviest section caught Vilma right across the upper back and shoulders, slamming her into the ground and burying her under a mountain of debris. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but the damage was already done. The medical examiner found a crushed pelvis, multiple broken ribs, and punctured lungs. City inspectors later declared the entrance area unsafe and ordered additional structural repairs before the building could fully reopen. While Vilma fought over a parking spot, the next Karen picked a battle over a chicken she had already eaten. It was around 3 in the afternoon on March 7th, 2017, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was just your typical, boring Tuesday at a busy warehouse store. Shoppers were rattling carts down the aisles, and employees were gearing up for the evening rush. Near the entrance, customer service was handling the usual tedious stream of returns. Just a few feet away stood 54-year-old Brenda Ellie Netherwood. Now, Brenda was about to take the concept of a customer service dispute to a whole new, tragicomic level. After more than 20 years in retail, Brenda knew store policies better than most customers. The problem was that she treated every disagreement like a battle she had to win. I shudder just thinking about encountering someone like that. On this particular afternoon, Brenda marched in carrying a clear plastic container that had once held a hot rotisserie chicken. When I say once held, I mean there was almost nothing left inside. Just a few bones, bits of skin, and some greasy residue stuck to the bottom. She approached the desk and demanded a full refund because the chicken was disappointing. And I'm not even kidding. She ate the entire bird and still wanted her money back. Naturally, the employee politely explained that they weren't going to give a refund for a chicken that had already been eaten. Brenda immediately demanded a supervisor and kept the argument going for nearly 20 minutes. Then, in a moment that sounds completely ridiculous, her receipt slipped out of her hand. What Brenda didn't know was that employees had already been keeping an eye on the pallet behind her. A forklift operator noticed that part of the load had shifted slightly while it was being unloaded. It wasn't considered dangerous, but a few of the boxes near the top were leaning enough that workers planned to straighten everything out later that evening. Employees had already been told not to climb on it or put any extra weight on it until it could be restacked. She marched around the display and tried reaching behind the pallet herself. Surveillance footage actually showed her stretching farther and farther into the narrow gap. When she still couldn't reach it, she climbed onto the wooden base of the pallet and grabbed the plastic wrapping for leverage. Multiple employees shouted at her to get down, but Brenda ignored every single one of them. What she didn't realize was that shrink wrap isn't designed to support a human being, and because the load was already slightly shifted, the wrapping was doing more work than it was ever meant to. As she pulled, the plastic started tearing. Witnesses later described hearing a loud ripping sound, followed by sharp pops as the tightly packed cases shifted. At first, only a few boxes moved. Then, the already leaning upper section shifted several more inches forward. Employees shouted and rushed toward her. Brenda finally looked up, but by then, it was too late. The front corner of the pallet gave way, sending dozens of heavy cases of canned vegetables crashing down. The first boxes struck Brenda directly in the chest, knocking her backward. More cases followed, burying her. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. They found Brenda trapped under hundreds of pounds of goods. Sadly, despite emergency treatment, she died later that evening from massive chest compression injuries. The aisle remained closed for several days while investigators reviewed the incident. During the cleanup, employees eventually recovered the receipt Brenda had been trying to retrieve, but by then, it no longer mattered. In the end, she literally lost her life trying to recover a receipt for a refund she never would have received anyway. All because she couldn't let go of a chicken she had already eaten. The next Karen spent years obsessing over something even more ridiculous: her neighbor's bird feeder. It was around 9 in the morning on May 14th, 2013, in Des Moines, Iowa. The sky was clear. Temperatures sat in the low 60s, and a light breeze moved through the neighborhood. Neighbors were heading to work, tending gardens, and moving through their usual routines. Honestly, it sounds like the kind of peaceful, quiet morning we all hope for. 61-year-old Anastasia Oldham had spent nearly 30 years working as a school secretary, so she was very dependable and organized. But when I look at what happened after she retired, it seems pretty clear to me that she suddenly had far too much free time on her hands. She became heavily involved in neighborhood disputes, attended every meeting she could find, and filed complaints about problems that most people barely noticed. Her biggest obsession was an elderly neighbor's bird feeder. Anastasia was convinced it attracted rodents, but every inspection found the same thing. There was nothing wrong with it. The feeder was legal, clean, and entirely on private property. Instead of accepting that, Anastasia decided to handle the problem herself. That morning, she saw her elderly neighbor leave for a medical appointment and took it as her chance. She grabbed an extension ladder, a cordless power saw, and several hand tools before crossing onto the property. A nearby doorbell camera captured the entire thing. The structure stood roughly 8 feet tall. Several heavy metal feeders hung from a thick wooden support arm attached to a vertical post. Anastasia positioned the ladder against the structure and climbed up carrying the saw. Her plan was simple: cut through the support arm and bring the entire thing down. Unfortunately for Anastasia, physics had its own plan. And let's be real, physics doesn't care about neighborhood feuds. The doorbell footage showed her sawing through the wood for nearly a minute. As the cut deepened, the support arm began sagging under the weight of the feeders. Instead of climbing down, Anastasia kept cutting. Then the remaining wood suddenly snapped. The heavy arm whipped sideways with surprising force. One of the metal support rods tore loose from its mounting bracket and swung through the air like a spear. Witnesses later described hearing a loud crack followed by the sound of metal crashing against the ground. The detached steel rod struck Anastasia directly in the upper chest. The impact knocked the air out of her instantly and sent her backward against the ladder. The entire feeder assembly collapsed moments later, bringing several heavy feeders and sections of wood down on top of her. By the time neighbors rushed outside, they found Anastasia tangled beneath the wreckage she had spent years trying to get rid of. Someone immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but despite emergency surgery, doctors were unable to save her from extensive internal injuries. The sheer irony here is just impossible for me to ignore. After years of complaints, reports, arguments, and inspections, the very bird feeder Anastasia had devoted so much energy to fighting ultimately became the thing that killed her. The elderly neighbor later repaired the structure and put it back in the exact same spot. Before long, the birds returned as if nothing had ever happened. Anastasia spent years obsessing over what her neighbors were doing in their own yard. This next case had a different hobby. She preferred turning complete strangers into the stars of her latest public confrontation. It was late afternoon on October 11th, 2016, in Bellevue, Washington. The post-work rush was filling a busy hillside shopping center. Cars crawled through packed parking lanes while shoppers loaded groceries and hurried between stores. A cool breeze pushed loose carts and scattered fallen leaves across the pavement. Just beyond the busy storefronts, 49-year-old Carolyn Jane Walston was finishing her weekly shopping trip. At her insurance job, Carolyn was well-liked, dependable, and always willing to help. Outside of work, however, she had a habit of getting involved in public disagreements. Friends and family knew that once Carolyn felt she was right about something, she rarely backed down. Carolyn seemed to treat every disagreement like it deserved its own documentary. If a conflict started, her phone was usually recording within seconds. Customer complaints, parking lot disputes, arguments with businesses, you name it. She liked having a record of it all. People who knew her said she rarely backed down, even when the issue was minor. That afternoon, Carolyn loaded her groceries into her SUV and left her shopping cart loose in the parking lot instead of returning it. As she checked her phone, a strong gust of wind caught the cart and sent it rolling down the sloped lane, where it slammed into a parked luxury SUV and left a noticeable dent. Naturally, the owner saw the whole thing happen and immediately approached Carolyn. Witnesses said he looked irritated but remained calm. But instead of exchanging insurance information like a normal adult, Carolyn instantly switched into full Karen mode. Out came the phone. I swear, nowadays some people think a smartphone screen is an invisibility shield that makes them immune to reality. Within seconds, she was loudly recording the man and accusing him of harassing her. Carolyn had convinced herself that every minor disagreement was a public service announcement that needed to be documented. She started filming his face, narrating the situation for an imaginary online audience, and following him around the parking lot while he repeatedly asked her to put the phone away and discuss the damage. I honestly cringe just thinking about how exhausting it must be to live with that kind of entitlement. Several shoppers stopped to watch. A store employee suggested exchanging information and letting security handle it, but Carolyn ignored him. The SUV owner eventually gave up and walked toward the entrance. Carolyn followed, still filming and still arguing. Witnesses later said she seemed completely focused on her phone screen. Unfortunately, the argument was happening only a few yards from the shopping cart return area. Security footage showed Carolyn walking backward to keep the SUV owner in frame. Behind her sat a long line of nested shopping carts inside the cart corral. Several bystanders shouted warnings, but Carolyn either didn't hear them or ignored them. Then, she backed straight into the metal rail of the cart return. Her legs tangled with the front cart, causing her to stumble. As she tried to recover, she instinctively grabbed the row of nested carts, and that turned out to be the absolute worst thing she could have done. The cart line broke free and rolled down the slight incline. Carolyn lost her balance and fell backward. One of the carts struck her legs, sending her head first into the rear bumper of a parked pickup truck, and the concrete wheel stopped beneath it. Several carts rolled into her moments later, pinning her against the vehicle. By the time bystanders pulled them away, Carolyn was completely unresponsive. Paramedics rushed Carolyn to a nearby trauma center, but she died later that evening from severe head injuries. Security footage and witness statements later confirmed that the shopping cart chain reaction began after Carolyn backed into the cart corral while filming the argument. Her phone continued recording after the fall, capturing nothing but the cloudy sky above the parking lot until emergency responders arrived. While Carolyn spent her time filming strangers, the next Karen had a habit of treating every minor inconvenience like a full-scale emergency. It was around 11:45 a.m. on November 5th, 2019, in downtown Portland, Oregon. Cold rain had fallen since sunrise. Inside a busy independent cafe, windows were fogged from damp coats. Umbrellas crowded the entrance, and the pre-lunch rush filled the room with impatient office workers and constant movement. 44-year-old Janika Paris. Janika made her living buying secondhand items and reselling them online. The work required patience and attention to detail, which she definitely had. Unfortunately, she applied those same skills to finding things to complain about. Friends described her as someone who could turn a minor inconvenience into a full-scale customer service investigation. I've met people like this, and they are absolutely exhausting to be around. Over the years, Janica developed quite the reputation. If a meal arrived slightly late, she complained. If a cashier sounded distracted, she complained. And if a manager disagreed with her, she simply complained louder. Shortly before noon, Janica entered the cafe and ordered a large black coffee. The first cup wasn't hot enough. The second wasn't hot enough either. Neither was the third. By the time the fourth cup was returned, the line behind her stretched nearly to the door. Personally, I think most people would have either accepted the coffee or gone somewhere else by that point. But Janica wasn't most people. When the barista handed over cup number 5, Janica decided to verify the temperature herself. She removed the lid, lifted the cup toward her face, and tilted it. Immediately, a small splash of hot coffee jumped over the rim and struck her cheek. It wasn't a serious burn, it was just painful and embarrassing. But to Janica, it was apparently the greatest injustice in coffee history. She began loudly accusing the staff of negligence, shouting over anyone who tried to speak. Eventually, she demanded to speak directly to management. When an employee asked her to wait because the manager was busy, that answer only made things worse. I guess she just couldn't handle not getting her way immediately. Security footage later showed Janica storming around the counter and entering an employee-only section. Oof. Multiple workers told her to stop, but she ignored every one of them. Determined to confront someone, Janica pushed through a swinging service door, having absolutely no idea where it led. Behind the door was the cafe's dishwashing area, crowded with sinks and several tall rolling metal racks loaded with freshly washed ceramic mugs. Employees immediately began shouting for her to get out, but Janica kept moving. Still arguing, she took several quick steps across the damp floor. You can probably guess where this is going. Her shoe slipped, her body lurched, and she slammed shoulder first into one of the loaded storage racks. The impact knocked the heavy rack off balance, and it began tipping right toward her. Janica tried to move, but she didn't make it. The heavy metal frame crashed down first, followed by dozens of shattering ceramic mugs. Employees rushed to help and called emergency services immediately. Paramedics transported her to a trauma center, but despite emergency surgery for severe chest trauma and internal bleeding, she tragically died later that evening. The employee-only area remained closed while investigators reviewed the incident and interviewed witnesses. Janica turned a minor coffee dispute into a fatal confrontation, but the next Karen had a different obsession entirely, controlling what everyone else did with their property. It was June 29th, 2021, in Frisco, Texas. Temperatures were pushing toward triple digits, and most residents stayed indoors behind closed blinds and running air conditioners. The streets were nearly empty, with only a few landscaping crews working through the intense summer heat. Out in that brutal weather was 59-year-old Sharon Margaret Philby, a retired bank manager. Organized and controlling by nature, Sharon poured much of her retirement energy into the neighborhood HOA. Over the next 6 years, she became HOA president and earned a reputation for obsessing over lawn violations, grass height, and even the smallest property issues. That morning, Sharon bought a bottle of concentrated commercial herbicide. The warning label explicitly told users to wear protection and absolutely not use it during extreme heat. The forecast even warned that afternoon temperatures would hit 100 degrees. But did Sharon care about science or basic survival instincts? Absolutely not. She decided her war on weeds simply could not wait. By early afternoon, she was outside spraying weeds. Witnesses later told me they saw her marching around during the absolute hottest part of the day. One neighbor actually tried to intervene by offering some bottled water, but Sharon just brushed them off. I get the feeling that accepting help just didn't fit her stubborn vibe. As the hours went on, that brutal Texas heat grew worse. Neighbors told me they watched her face turn bright red, noticing that she had to stop frequently at fences just to rest. One resident even mentioned to me that they saw her stand completely still for nearly a minute before she forced herself to keep walking. It's incredibly sad to me that even though she was clearly struggling, she chose not to stop. A backyard security camera later captured the exact moment the universe decided she had pushed her luck too far. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Sharon was still out there clutching her herbicide. The footage showed her dragging her feet, and her steps became uneven. Over the next several minutes, her coordination completely went out the window. which actually makes sense because heat stroke turns your brain into literal mush. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, Sharon finally turned toward her patio, but halfway across the yard, her knees completely buckled. She pitched forward without even putting her hands out to break the fall, and her face slammed directly into the raised concrete border of a flower bed. The impact was incredibly violent, fracturing her jaw and shattering parts of her face. The security footage showed her body going completely still. In a sad twist of irony, no one nearby heard a thing because everyone was indoors with their windows shut and their air conditioners roaring. Sharon was left lying face down on the scorching hot concrete for hours. Shortly before sunset, a neighbor walking a dog finally noticed someone collapsed in the backyard. Paramedics rushed to the scene in about 8 minutes, finding Sharon completely unresponsive. They tried everything to bring her back, but it was way too late. The medical examiner later found that Sharon suffered from severe dehydration and advanced heat stroke, noting that her body temperature stayed dangerously elevated even after she passed away. The heat had caused total failure of multiple organs, with the brutal facial fractures heavily contributing to her death. It was a completely avoidable disaster. News spread quickly through the neighborhood because everyone knew Sharon as the HOA rule enforcer. In the months that followed, the association voted to relax several landscaping rules. As for the weeds Sharon died trying to kill, they sat untouched for weeks because nobody wanted to go near them.